So one of the things that's driving the New Conversations initiative is that New Brunswickers have questions about immigration, legitimate questions about immigration. Questions like, what's wrong with an aging population? What's the problem, right? They're doing it in Japan with very little immigration. Why do we need immigrants when young people are still leaving the province? Why don't we try to take care of them or have them work the jobs on offer? With unemployment so high, why do we need more immigrants, right? So we do have a higher unemployment rate than we'd like to see in the province. So why do we need immigrants? Part of the problem is employers don't pay enough. Why don't they just pay more? If an employer would pay $5 or $10 more an hour, maybe they'd get more workers. Why do we spend money attracting immigrants when we should be spending that money improving the lives of New Brunswickers? So these are some of the questions that we hear around the province and that we've been hearing now for a number of years. So we're trying to tackle these questions as we go around the province. So I'm going to talk about the challenge here. I don't want to blast you with my speech. So until a decade ago, most of our labor market was growing at a rate of about several thousand new entrants per year. So every year, upwards of 3,000 people on average were joining the labor market. So it doesn't seem like a big number, but it actually, in the context of a labor market of only about 350,000 people, that's actually a solid rate of growth every year. But almost all of this growth came from New Brunswickers. So young New Brunswickers joined the workforce. We had more women joining the workforce. We had just a cross-section of folks joining the workforce, but most of them were from New Brunswick. We had very low levels of immigration. We had very low levels of migration from other parts of Canada. But now, as of 2018, the labor market is in structural decline and has been since 2008, and I've got slides to show you on that. And we need a substantial boost in immigration to ensure that our key industries, export industries, but also local industries, have enough workers to provide the services that they provide. I would argue this is the biggest public policy challenge of our time. I know we've got some older folks in the room, but I do believe it's similar in scale to equal opportunity in the 1960s. In the 1960s, we were trying to solve a social justice issue. It was an issue of equality of opportunity around the province, of fairness, and it was a big deal. And in large part, we've really achieved many of the goals of the equal opportunity movement since the 60s. But I think now, if we're looking at attracting, and this is not an official government number, this is my sort of target, based on the labor market now and into the future, I think we're probably going to need to attract and retain somewhere around 150,000 immigrants over the next 20 years. So this is a very, very big, bold, and audacious challenge, and how we do that really matters. We're trying to do something rarely, if ever, been done in the history of Canada, a massive boost in immigration in a short period of time. Now, in fact, I looked it up today, and of course I looked it up on Wikipedia, which I'm not sure we have no reason to doubt Wikipedia, but Wikipedia tells us that between 1815 and 1867, St. John attracted 150,000 immigrants. That's about 3,000 a year over that 50-year period, and that's basically the number I think you need to attract now. So we just have to go back to the future. But 150,000 immigrants, many of them were Irish, but they settled or came and landed and settled in St. John over a 50-year period. So this city and region in particular has a very interesting history with immigration. The problem is it's a long, long time ago, and we're going to talk about that a bit more as we go through the presentation. Okay, so what's at stake? Well, in my view, the difference is between a healthy and vibrant economy generating enough tax revenue to fund public services, which is really the fundamental underlying goal here. If we really thought we could have a good quality healthcare system, good quality education system, the tax revenue needed to fund public services effectively, with a shrinking economy, there wouldn't be this really as much urgency as we have now, but I really don't believe we can. The alternative to that is an economy where firms increasingly can't find workers, and we're hearing that in every stop around the province, by the way, and they can't provide the services, and it's an increasingly challenging environment to generate tax revenue. So if you can't generate tax revenue through natural economic growth, the other way to generate tax revenue is by putting up tax rates and by squeezing more tax revenue out of the existing pot of economic activity. And I think most of us would agree there's not a lot of room to continue to rise the HST and income tax rates. So if we want to have a sustainable rate of growth in public spending, we have to have economic growth. And to have economic growth, we have to have the labor market to do it. That's the fundamental case. So ultimately, we're talking about managing the challenges of growth versus managing the challenges of decline. And what do those challenges look like? Well, you can either have a conversation about how you integrate immigrant kids into our schools, or which taxes to raise to be able to fund healthcare. How do we convince firms to hire more immigrants and integrate them into their workforce? Or how do we generate sustainable tax revenue as firms downsize and close? So these are just the differences between the growth challenges and decline challenges. How do we attract and retain immigrants in rural areas, which is a need in this province, and we've seen that around as we've gone around the province, or which schools, hospitals, and roads should we close? So we may still have to close schools and hospitals and roads. This is part of, government planning over time, right? But ultimately, if we don't have the population in communities, we're going to have to downsize our infrastructure. So this is a chart just showing how things have changed since the 1970s. So in 1971, we were the second youngest province in Canada as measured by median age. So that's the age at which half the population is over and half the population is under. So in 1971, that was under 24 years old. So half of everybody living in the province at that time was under the age of 24. A massive demographic dividend that was used over the last 40 years. In 2017, you'll see the median age is 45.3. And as I like to tell the politicians, that means the median age of a voter is closer to 60. And that also changes the dynamic of how politicians interact with the public when the median age of people that vote is closer to 60. We have to take that into consideration when we're having this conversation around immigration. So this is the labor force. I said it's basically started to peak around 2008. This is province-wide. I've got St. John's specific numbers coming up. But basically, if you look at the entire province since the 70s, and really before that, there was this incremental growth in the labor market. And the labor market is basically everybody working or looking for work or actively looking for work. And that peaked around 2008. You can see it kind of flatlined in 2008 and started to decline in the last few years. So I don't want to get overly technical with you this evening, but I just wanted to show you the relationship between economic growth and labor market growth. So you can see the chart here on your left is showing the average annual rate of growth in the labor market or the labor force for New Brunswick and Canada. Canada's blue, New Brunswick is red. And you can see that our labor force grew not as fast as the rest of the country, but still it grew about 0.7% per year between 1990 and 2010. And then from 2010 to 2016, as I said, it's been in decline, whereas across the country, it continues to grow. If you look at the chart on your right, the chart to the far right, you'll see economic growth or GDP growth. And across the country, again, a slight dip, but still pretty strong growth of about 2% per year, whereas we've dropped down to about 0.4%, slightly higher because of, this is just showing through 2016, and in 2017, we had a pretty solid rate of economic growth. But even with that year, it's still 0.5 economic growth in an average year between 2010 and 2017. So what does a declining workforce mean for the province and for the community? So Richard Sion has crunched the numbers, my colleague on this tour, the economist. He thinks we could lose around 30,000 workers in the next 15 years. I think that's a fairly low number, a very conservative number, but still, even at that, because a lot of that decline will be in export-oriented industries, that's billions of dollars in economic activity and hundreds of millions in lost tax revenue if we see that decline in the labor market that he's predicting. Meanwhile, demand for public services will only grow. We have about 65,000 people aged 75 and older, and that's really when the bulk of your healthcare costs kick in. In 15 years from now, there will be about 130,000 or double that amount. So we want to make sure we have enough money in the kitty, enough tax dollars in the kitty to effectively pay for public services. And the way to do that is by having enough people in the labor market paying tax revenue. So why are young people still leaving? One of the main, if not the main questions we get asked. We do still have a net negative migration rate among people under the age of 30 in the province. Now, increasingly in the data, some of those people might actually be immigrants that settle here and then move on. But still, we do have a negative rate of young people leaving the province. The reality is they leave for a variety of reasons. They leave for post-secondary education, they leave for career opportunities not available in their hometown or their province, and some of them just want to see the world and experience other places, and I think that's perfectly fine. What we need to do is we need to see a significant increase in younger people joining our labor market. They can come from the local population, they can come from across Canada, although that's going to be even harder now because the rest of the country is also facing the same challenges, and you'll see that in a minute. Or we can attract more immigrants, and I think that ultimately is really where we need to be headed. So what's the immigration imperative? To reverse the tide of a declining labor force. We need to encourage more New Brunswickers to join the labor market. So again, young people should be exposed to opportunities here. Older New Brunswickers need to think about staying in the workforce longer. That's a perfectly legitimate option, and I know the pedal table in the back is thinking about that. We have the second lowest employment rate among the population 55 and older in the country, so there's probably some more people in that pool of labor, but ultimately it's not going to be enough. We are going to have to attract and retain a significant number of new immigrants. So this is probably one of the most important slides in my presentation. This is showing the growth in the labor market between 2013 and 2017. On the top, that's Canada. So if you look at the number of people that were born in Canada that joined the labor market between 2013 and 2017, that number's actually declined. So there's been a net decline among those born in Canada joining the labor market across the country. Sound familiar? That's our problem, but it's also a challenge across the country. The difference is that there's been 590,000 immigrants join the workforce across the country over that same period. So immigrants made up all net growth in the labor market between 2013 and 2017. If you look at the New Brunswick numbers, we have 3,100 immigrants growth in the labor market, but we've seen a 15,300 decline among those born in Canada. So really, this is the fundamental issue. If we want to grow our labor market, if we want to ensure we have enough workers for industries, we're going to have to, just like the rest of the country, attract more immigrants into our labor market. So there is a correlation between immigration and economic growth, as I said earlier. If you look at the provincial numbers going back to 2017, Manitoba has led the country in economic growth, and that's without any oil and gas, very little natural resources development in Manitoba, but they've also led the country in immigrant growth. So they were early into the game, they figured out that by boosting immigrant numbers, ensuring industries have the right workers, that they would see strong economic growth. I've highlighted PEI here because they also did the same thing. They brought in a whole bunch of immigrants, and it was kind of carnage over there. It wasn't very strategic, but they just brought in a whole lot, and they lost over 50% of them, but enough stayed, and they actually saw significantly more economic growth compared to New Brunswick over that period. So there are some myths. We've been talking about that, and we'll continue to talk about it later at the tables, but some of the myths that we've been hearing is that wages in New Brunswick are not competitive enough to attract immigrants, and in fact, that is the case in certain industries and in certain occupations. The reality is but we've been talking about all along about making sure there's alignment between the types of people that are coming to the province and the jobs on offer. So we want, as much as possible, we don't want doctors driving taxis, right? Which is the the common cliche that people make, not just for New Brunswick, but across the country. Ultimately, you want to bring people in. If you need loggers, bring in loggers. If you need truck drivers, bring in truck drivers. If you need back office workers, bring in back office workers. If you need IT workers, bring in IT workers. But for the most part, in those industries, wages are fairly competitive. The overall wage in New Brunswick is about 11% below the national average, and the cost of living is slightly lower here as well. So on balance, this really isn't an issue. Governments subsidize immigrant wages. We hear this. And in fact, we have to differentiate between the refugee population and the economic immigrants. Economic immigrants hit the ground running, and they start paying taxes and contributing right away, and are not subsidized by government. Immigrants and temporary foreign workers are paid less than local residents. Again, not only is that not allowed by the policies, it's just not something we're seeing in the market. So this is not an issue. Immigrants and immigration lowers local wages. Well, again, there's no evidence to support that. If you look at Manitoba, they've had faster wage growth than the rest of the country, even as they've seen a significant influx of immigrants and PEI as well. And then finally here, immigrants take the jobs of New Brunswickers. And again, there's no evidence to support that. In fact, what we're trying to do is bring in enough immigrants to create more demand for local services and actually create more jobs and more opportunity for New Brunswickers. So there's no evidence to support that claim.